So, welcome back, and we're going to hear now from Neil, who has a very interesting experience to talk about, and it's all going to be about Forest Church. It's not going to be about how to do Forest Church, but it's about Neil's personal experience of it for 20 minutes. Thanks, Neil.
Right, bingo. Hopefully we're firing on all cylinders now. So thank you very, very much for being invited today. As Deborah rightly pointed out, this is not a how-to. It's 20 minutes where George has kindly guided me on particular questions that he'd like me to address during the talk. Just to be clear at the outset, I'm not a theologian and I'm not an academic. I'm speaking very much from the heart about what Forest Church is from my perspective and what it does for me. On the first slide, I'd just like to read out a quote which I think for me sets the tone for Forest Church completely. And I know some of you will be familiar with this from John Muir, who was a 19th century Scotsman who emigrated to America. And he said, "I'd rather be in the mountains thinking about God than in a church thinking about the mountains." So as I said, George sent me sort of some questions to address in the 20 minutes that I had with you. The first is about why do I feel drawn to Forest Church? And then secondly, I'll go on to talk about how it can be used as both a tool for engagement and for change. But first, in terms of why I felt drawn to Forest Church, it's probably important to first touch upon what my early experience of church was. And the earliest experience I have of church was, I think I was about 8 years old. And I can remember that I attended some sort of event to do with Cubs, I think at the time, maybe Scouts. And we had to go to this very sort of old, well, no, not old, actually, it was a Victorian church. And it was that very dark red brick that sometimes Victorian churches were built with. And inside the church, I can remember it was very dark. And I seem to remember there was what you might refer to as the smell of incense, so, or what might be familiar with a high Anglican church or a Catholic church. So I can remember it was quite a dark experience, felt very enclosed, and I felt nervous. I felt a bit uneasy, and I basically wasn't relaxed. And I can tell that's very true because it still resonates with me now, several decades later. And I suppose after then, you know, that was when I was about 8 years old. I then got given my Gideon Bible when I was at secondary school, but I didn't really start to attend church until I was in my 30s. But over time, I became gradually and not necessarily consciously aware of just how many times Jesus spent time in the wilderness and how often he would retreat to the wilderness to spend time with God, talking with God. And that would often obviously last very many days. And a book I read 2 years ago was the book called Ruthless Elimination of Hurry by John Mark Comer. And because he is a theologian and I'm not, he noted that there are 9 times in the Gospel of Luke where Jesus retreated to the wilderness. And indeed, obviously, most famously on the night before his crucifixion, he spent time in Gethsemane Garden. So Jesus spent a lot of time in the wilderness. And also in the last couple of years, I've been really lucky to come across an American multi-season adaptation of or creation of Jesus's life called The Chosen, which I thoroughly recommend to anybody to explore The Chosen on YouTube. And again, they've just finished recently showing season 2, so there's now 16 episodes. And the amount of times that Jesus is, you know, they are in the wilderness, the very nature of the land where they lived at the time was they were outside, they were camping. And Jesus very often would retreat, even in the first 2 seasons, to the wilderness to spend time with God. So Jesus is very much spending time in the wilderness. And then since Jesus, we of course have several Franciscans on the call here, I'm sure. And the life of St. Francis is then a sort of fast forwarding 1,000+ years to another inspiration for me, where, you know, Franciscan practice, particularly in Italy at the time, was not to worship in large buildings and churches and cathedrals, but instead to enjoy the simplicity of being outside and in nature with fellow creatures of creation. And of course, St. Francis wrote the famous Canticle of the Creatures as a way of expressing solidarity or oneness or appreciation, many words you could use, with creation and all that creation gives to us, and being as fellow creatures of creation. And then more recently, I did a course a few years ago called Christian, Rural and Environmental Studies. And in the first module, which is called, I think, Living World, there was various sort of extracts from various theologians over the time. And the one that resonated with me most was by Charles Spurgeon, who was a 19th century Baptist. And one of the quotes that they provided was saying that he said that a defence is required for services within buildings rather than for worship outside. Again, enforcing that, you know, being outside and worshipping outside is a perfectly valid part of expressing our worship of God. And then if I think outside of any theological or Christian or faith context, I think it's being outside anyway is just that a way to connect with what is in us all and always has been. I think, you know, it's really important to remember that, you know, buildings and bricks and mortar are a relatively modern creation, and I think there's something really deeply innate with all of us that is triggered consciously or subconsciously when we are in nature. And so I love being and doing Forest Church as a way of reminding myself and reminding my inner body what I'm used to ultimately over the many centuries and millennia. But it's also important to say that buildings obviously do serve a purpose, and churches do. But we were made, I think, to be in creation. And before I move on to the next question, this is just a lovely picture I took, I think about 4 years ago, the Forest Church evening that I did in Oxfordshire. This is on a local landmark called Whitnham Clumps. And this is looking north towards Oxford and down to the river. And we're just all stood there at that point in time together, but in silence. And, you know, we would spend, you know, 10, 15 minutes just in silence, just admiring what we could see around us. And that for me is just a great picture of how I'm using my time in Forest Church to connect with what's within me and what's around me. So the second question that Charles sent me was, how can it be used as a tool for engagement and change? So first I want to consider this image that I've created, just to set initially the context of what I'm going to talk about with regards to engagement. And I cannot emphasize enough the word sometimes there by changing its color, underlining it. And what I've set out there might resonate with some of you, some of the times, or some of you quite often. And it's that situation whereby sometimes the church and Christians, we can live in a relatively separate world to those of other faiths, those of no faith, or those that have a spirituality. And so next, in terms of talking about engagement, it's probably important to say what Forest Church therefore represents for me in terms of engagement. And really, there are 5 points here, and I've touched upon some of them already. It really gives me a deeper connection with nature and the seasons. And the way that Forest Church is done in the area I do is it's also a chance to learn about our heritage and our history, about a particular time of year, going back many centuries and millennia. It provides, importantly, a really regular time to stop in mindful wonder at what is around through all the seasons. And I spoke in our breakout group before we had this session, and gave us some little snippets of how I love doing things like taking the magnifying glass with me when I go on Forest Church to really notice what nature is doing and what there is in nature. And then for me, I'm also there to sense my place in the world and my relationship with God. And that's an important part for me of when I'm doing Forest Church. And then many ways similar to a traditional bricks and mortar church, we do finish with sharing food and sharing experiences with people. And indeed, next weekend, I'm really looking forward to my next Forest Church with my group here, where we're meeting at 6:45 in the morning, in a wood to watch the sunrise. But it's going to be lovely to be with people and then sharing some time with them. So those 5 points are really important to me, and therefore I see Forest Church as providing that opportunity to engage with people in that middle ground, and it basically allows me to engage with anybody on those 5 points that I set out, in a way that bricks and mortar churches just inherently would struggle to do. I mean, it's just, bricks and mortar church is what it is, and being outside is what it is. And I've particularly seen some lovely ways in which this has worked in reality. So I can remember, I think it was this photograph I took there when I was leading that session, and one of the participants had come along and we got chatting on our way up to the top of the hill, and she said, "I'm a pagan." And it was just a lovely experience that she felt very comfortable to come along to what was labelled as Forest Church, and to share with us and experience together all the 5 points I put down there that connect us. And that was one lovely experience where I was just so pleased that she came along. And secondly, some of you may remember I did a talk a year ago, as I mentioned at the start, for about an hour on the Green Christian. And one of my dear friends was on that call, along with her vicar for her local parish. And I've loved hearing since I did that talk that they've been doing Forest Church in their particular parish, and they've been using it to do exactly what I'm suggesting in that image on the screen. They've used it to engage with people in their parish that maybe they know are hesitant to come into church. They've used it as a tool to engage with their community, which is quite a small community. And I absolutely loved hearing what they did. In fact, I was really in awe at how interesting a session they produced, where they basically did a tour of their village and stopped at various points within nature and had various points of reading and poems and stuff to share as they did that. And it's just been lovely to see how that's been used since I did that talk as an engagement tool. So why are we engaging? Well, as I said, it can pick up upon all those 5 points that I mentioned that Forest Church does for me. And ultimately, in the context of Green Christian and why I particularly like doing is that climate change and biodiversity loss needs us to engage with everybody. Climate change and biodiversity loss does not care about what my faith is or is not. It just needs me to act. And Forest Church provides a great way to engage with people on that shared concern. So it is a tool for change. And the second quote I've got there, I think beautifully encapsulates that. It's by Thomas Berry, and I shall read it out in case you can't see it on your particular screen. Thomas Berry said, "It has been said that we will not save what we do not love. It is also true that we will neither love nor save what we do not experience as sacred." And so if climate change and biodiversity loss is one focus for our engagement and our reasons to engage, and I really think that Forest Church provides everybody with a magical way of being both a tool to engage with people and to be changed. So just to conclude, there very much is a place for bricks and mortar church from my perspective. But when I remember the times that Jesus was in the wilderness, and I fully embrace the opportunities that Forest Church presents, I see it as giving free things it can give to you. It can give you as an individual all the healing benefits and all the engagements with nature benefits and all the engagement benefits with God. But it also can allow you to provide an opportunity to be a bridge in that gap that might exist between your church and your community. And it can also be a tool ultimately for wider change, as you can use Forest Church to have conversations that can go on to recognise and work on a shared appreciation to respond to the climate change and biodiversity emergency that we're facing. So I think I've managed to do that in a possibly welcome 15 minutes rather than 20 minutes. But that's all I have to say on Forest Church. But thank you very much indeed.